I've spent my life in Georgia, and I love hiking all over, but I must admit, North Carolina has the best mountains. For this reason, I frequently drive up there and hike and camp. This time, I went up with my family in an RV and stayed with them in Myuujii Valley. The next day, however, I had them drop me off about 10 miles away at the Cold Mountain Trailhead, and I planned to hike up there, spend the night, and be back down in the morning. I was by no means inexperienced at hiking or camping, but I had never camped alone. On top of that, I didn't bring a pistol, something I will not go without now. On the way up, the trail was surprisingly strenuous, not necessarily steep. I've hiked some steep stuff out west, but more like a ton of ups and downs and feeling like it would never end. Eventually it began to get darker, and I realized I needed to stop and set up while I still had light. So I stopped about a half mile short of the summit and figured I would continue in the morning. Nothing eventful happened. I set up camp in a really good spot, ate my food, and went into the tent. At this point, I realized I hadn't run into a single other person my entire way up. This wasn't eerie at the time, but soon would be. I have trouble sleeping, and I usually lay awake for up to an hour trying to sleep. During this time, I thought I heard someone lightly walking around the general area because of the rhythm of the steps. I brushed it off as my mind running wild, but I did pull my knife out of my bag for extra security and had that next to me. That morning, I woke up and ate oatmeal. As I ate, I looked over at my tent and noticed a strange bundle of dried twigs and berries tied with a green cord, propped against my tent. Internally, I was pissing myself, but I packed my crap up and took off within 5 minutes. And there was no way I bothered going to the summit at this point. I headed straight down. On the way down, I realized that there was a pretty heavy fog, and I ended up taking a side trail that eventually ended, and I was lost. I used a compass to eventually reorient myself and found the trail again, one of my biggest reliefs. I made it out with no other incident. However, come to find out the same morning, a 27-year-old died on the same section of trail as me. And it's possible I would have run into him if I hadn't gotten lost and rejoined the trail later. The scariest part of all this was knowing that someone knew where I was and watched me, and I had no idea about them. Yesterday, I took a drive up through Wyoming and then took Mirror Lake Scenic Byway back down into Utah. My grandma passed away a week ago, and I needed some time to clear my head, which I often do with a drive. Mirror Lake Highway is beautiful, and being a Wednesday, it wasn't crowded at all, so I could take my time and enjoy it. One of the pull-offs on the road is the Slate Gorge Overlook. There's a short trail that leads to the overlook, and you can then look down into the gorge. It's not super big, and see the Provo River. No one was there, so I took a seat and let my mind wander a bit. So I've been sitting there for about 20 minutes or so when I see something come out from behind the trees. I got excited thinking it was a moose or an elk, and I always like seeing those. But what appeared was what looked like a hunched over person that was sort of half walking, half crawling, rather slowly. While that in itself was weird, it was even stranger that it looked like the person was wearing a really heavy, crudely fashioned gray fur coat with a hood, but one that was several sizes too small on them. It almost looked like it was a part of them, like they had fur themselves, but that didn't really make any sense to me. It was also around 80 out, with temps clipping 100 in the valley, so it was not cold by any means. While the sides are kind of steep, you can get down into the gorge without too much of an issue. I kind of thought it was someone doing a TikTok at first, or something like that, but I didn't see anyone else around to be filming. Eventually, whatever it was made it to the water and stuck its head in for a drink. As it looked like it was finishing, a group of people started to come up from the overlook, and they had kids with them who were making a bunch of noise. It can echo pretty easily through the gorge, and the person or whatever it was heard it and took off incredibly fast on all fours over pretty uneven terrain. I am sort of conflicted between a person in a fursuit and just something I don't know, but the way they moved seemed unnaturally human, especially when the noise spooked it and it took off running. Both seem plausible, and I really don't want to immediately jump to conclusions on what it could be. I'm a wilderness survival instructor and security contractor. A couple of days ago, a student of mine, and also a good friend who I had taken out into the woods before, told me his dad just got 150 acres of land in a secluded, mountainous part of my state. It had a large forest on it, and it hadn't been explored yet, as his dad was only building something for his horses that took up about 100 yards of the property, and his horses were free to roam at the moment. He said his dad got an insane deal on the property. My friend is now a dad of 3, and I know he doesn't get out into the woods that often, so I agreed to go with him because it seemed like a really fun opportunity, and I can imagine he needs a getaway every now and then. We are both indigenous, into cars, into wilderness survival, and all sorts of stuff, so essentially, we never run out of anything to talk about in the woods. His dad, however, told us that he didn't want anybody exploring the woods unless we had a gun. He said it was because he saw coyotes. So, since we're all indigenous here, we were raised in the same state. Coyotes don't actually attack people, really. My friend, who we'll call RC, also told me a while back, when he was first at the property, he saw movement in the tree lines that was roughly human-sized and shaped, but couldn't really tell since his eyesight isn't that good. So I brought my AR and a small flint napping kit, just for the fun of it, and we set off into the property. We explored a lot of the rolling fields, creeks, multiple natural springs and ponds. Everything felt normal. It was a beautiful landscape. Eventually, we decided to get to the forested part of the property, as it hadn't been explored yet. As soon as we entered the tree line, the entire mood shifted. The forest had an ambience of its own, very similar to the woods in the movie The Ritual. The woods were gray and dead silent, aside from the occasional cracking of tall, tired cedar trees. There was also a very small stream running through the center of it with sand that was black. It honestly felt like we were surrounded, being watched from all sides. It didn't take long before a very putrid stench hit our nostrils. It was the odor of rotting flesh. We decided to follow the smell and found the remains of 3 to 4 cows. We examined the exposed skulls and I couldn't find any bullet holes. It didn't appear to me that the cows had been put down. Something had definitely killed them though, and their bones were spread out over about 30 yards. There were large indentations in the dirt all around them that were very vague in their shape. We decided to press on into the woods. Now we were accompanied only by silence, the putrid odor of death, and the sound of our own heartbeats. We kept stopping at the stream as I noticed several different types of tracks. Large coyote tracks, and something else that was large, but intentionally avoided the sand it seemed. We pressed on into the woods until we started to find trees that had been bent over and pinned behind other trees while they were still alive, something that could never, ever happen naturally. We hiked on and found what only I could describe as a tool made of bone lying on the ground. It was extremely crude, but looked like some kind of scooping tool or knife. It was disturbing because although it looked primitive, it looked like it was way more primitive than a person would make, but an intentionally shaped tool nonetheless. We hiked on until we found a clearing with a pond that had more large oval tracks surrounding it. On the other side of the pond, we found a very strange little tree structure. It was in a frame. It had rocks placed up against it. However, it wasn't that sturdy, and the rocks were very oddly placed. We found no camping trash. This wasn't exactly a place you could hike to from a house. It was getting pretty dark, so we decided to head back. I had a flashlight on my AR, but I didn't want to rely on that. In the dark, especially, with something that kills cows and makes tools out of their bones somewhere behind us. We made our way out of the forest and back to where the trucks were parked, just in time before it got too dark to see. As we were leaving, we saw something on top of one of the hills that we couldn't identify, but didn't stick around to find out what it was. It's worth mentioning the previous owner began construction of something on the property, abruptly halted construction, and left.